Welcome to the official Debrief podcast. My name is Michael Mataluni, and I'm thrilled today. I'm joined by our guest, Tom Rogan. Tom is a foreign policy-focused commentary writer for the Washington Examiner. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts in War Studies from King's College London, a Master's of Science in Middle East Politics from SOAS, and a graduate diploma in law from the University of Law in London. Among others, he's previously written for The Washington Post, The Independent, The Atlantic, The National Review, The Telegraph, The Guardian. My goodness, Tom, you've been busy. How are you today?
Good to be with you, Michael. I'm good. How are you?
I am fantastic, and I'm really excited to have you. You've recently done an interview with an article with our very own Tim McMillan, and the title of that article is "The Decades-Long UFO Taboo the Biden Administration Will Have to Face." I'm really curious, what inspired you to do this article with Tim?
Well, Tim and I have become friends sort of working on this issue, and obviously the Debrief being a relatively new publication that is really at the forefront and kind of reporting on some of these evolving issues at the margin of technology and potentially conflict, but machinery, theoretical physics, etc. Tim thought it would be just a good idea, perhaps if we both put our name to a piece, in the sense of hopefully binding perhaps a more traditional foreign policy, national security journalist as myself, with Tim being on that other side of kind of the new frontier of national security. And so I think really our primary purpose was to put our names on the same thing and sort of hopefully say to people, this is something that is a real concern, both in Washington and everywhere else around the world, and trying to give it a little bit more credibility, perhaps, in the sense that it still remains a subject, the UAP issue, in which a lot of journalists and scientists are reluctant to engage.
Right. It's very difficult. There's certainly a cultural taboo, both in the scientific community as well as the journalistic community, to approach some of these topics. And I find it fascinating because this year, the Pentagon finally released and authorized the release of the UAP video footage that so many of the Debrief listeners have seen and watched. What are your thoughts? Like, having had the opportunity, it sounds to me like this is something you're a bit fascinated with. What are your thoughts on UAPs in general from your perspective?
Well, from my understanding, in terms of people who have been or are in the military or the intelligence services, in government, members of Congress on certain committees that have been briefed on this, is that something really quite fascinating is going on, in the sense that we appear to have intelligently controlled machines performing in ways that are not within even, quite frankly, the developmental capability of any Earth nation or corporation. And so if you can accept that, that baseline, that and especially with credible witnesses, trained military observers, people being paid to fly, $100 million jets, people who have a lot to lose by speaking up, and then you compare it to, some of the existing literature going back really to the 1940s, it does pique curiosity, and something is going on. I think whether it's government, me, Tim, we know a lot less than what we do know, but what we do know should be enough, certainly from a journalistic point of view, to be aggressive in terms of wanting to cover the subject.
Right. All right. That's a great point. So what do you think? I mean, the article that you co-authored is about the Biden administration, and it's about the taboo. What do you see coming? I mean, do you guys actually think that we'll see something come out of the Biden administration on this?
I don't know whether it will be the Biden administration. I think the early signs are that they kind of want to push it off to the side a little bit and focus on their narrative as, just starting off. But I don't think that necessarily means they're trying to, bury the program or get rid of, the government's investigation into this issue, this phenomena. But whether it's the Biden administration or Senator Rubio, who is the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, there are people who, all members of the military, people who might want to leak. There are enough people now who believe this is a serious subject in government, requiring of serious investigation and greater public awareness. That ultimately, I think it is not possible for government to do what it has traditionally done with this subject, which is to allow it to remain in the preserve of, on one side, very hidden programs that are somewhat disorganized, and the other side allowing it to be the kind of fiefdom of more odd individuals who perhaps have their own ideas about it that are not necessarily vested in data points or scientific knowledge. Now, maybe those people are right, but it doesn't necessarily help the public credibility factor. And so, we are going to keep seeing more on this. Really, I do think those, again, the 2017 original videos and the New York Times report broke down the wall. That was a revolutionary moment in this subject.
Right, absolutely. So, your expertise really is in national defense, and you work a lot. A lot of your work is reporting overseas as well. From what you've seen when it comes to national defense and these sorts of things, one of the biggest arguments that people say when they talk about this sort of technology is, well, why can't it be a secret U.S., Russian, or Chinese development when it comes to this sort of technology? What do you say to that? It's so difficult to hide things from the public for so long. Like, is it possible that these things have just been purely hidden from the public?
Well, Michael, I think you hit the nail on the head there when you say for so long. One of the things that really, as I sort of engage with the subject, you can find very credible cross-reference points of military observers, sensor platforms, radar, etc., going back to the 40s and 50s, basically showing a correlation in capability within a relative sense of what we saw from the Tic Tac videos or the Cube, whatever you want to call it, and stuff, going back to the 40s and 50s. So if we think about the developmental stage of government programs, the F-117, the stealth Nighthawk, that was really in the 1980s, beginning, Gulf War, etc. That was so inferior then to what we saw in the 1940s and 50s. For us to say, well, it's a secret US government program then, what was the point of it if you're not going to use it, right? If the idea of a program is to deliver an objective, a national objective, maybe it's a private objective, we haven't seen it manifested. And I think secondly, and perhaps more importantly in the kind of forensic journalism point, the people who are engaged in the next generation of military capabilities are still talking about, or at least still building into the programs, our basic kind of engineering parameters in terms of avionics. We think about the hypersonic glide vehicles, which is going to be the new essentially nuclear weapons platform. That's still fuel based. Yes, there are some orbital kind of taking advantage of physics, but it's satellite capabilities, stealth in terms of absorbent, which what is being developed to come online in the next 20 years is still woefully inadequate compared to what some of these things we saw in the 1940s were. So yeah, I think it's very, and that applies both to Russia and China as well, and the Israelis. I think as well, we can be confident that it's not necessarily a kind of private sector thing that's, Thunderbird somewhere on an island have just been running around for 75 years, because ultimately the private sector has a profit incentive, or, if it's a non-governmental organization, it has a mission objective, whether it's deliver aid, whatever, science, research. There isn't a manifestation in capability or in development capability that matches what we are seeing. I suppose that's the top line.
Right. And I think it's so fascinating because, you look at somebody like David Fravor and what he and his team saw on those flights and the tic tac and coming up from the water and those sorts of things. And, these folks have thousands of hours of flight time. They have a lot to lose when it comes to approaching the taboo subject that is UAPs. And, that being said, in addition to this idea, well, maybe the government just doesn't want to show its hand. They're developing all these things undercover, and they don't want these other countries to see what they have. But it seems kind of preposterous to me that we would still be dumping billions and billions and billions of dollars into propulsion, combustion engine propulsion technology, when in fact we have this ability to create these extraordinary technologically advanced aerospace systems and vehicles that can stop on a dime and just accelerate at extraordinary speeds. For me, that explanation just begins to break down so significantly.
Well, and I think that's one reason why we look at some of the reporting from the war zone at the drive, certainly the debrief. The military has been and is interested in trying to replicate some of this, which shows two things. Number one, that they believe, very confidently that it's real machinery. Right. And number two, that they believe it's theoretically, if these things can do it, it is possible to do these things. But I also think, the fact that we are still investing such large amounts in the more conventional idea of capabilities, as much as we are researching this with added impetus, and I certainly think the evolving interest point on the part of the Chinese and Russians to understand how this stuff works, because they are seeing it, it is affecting them as well. The nature of their systems of government means that they are more able to keep it quiet. That baseline point that Lou Elizondo talks about a lot, which is very true, is even if you think this is probably a weather phenomenon or something, what that 1% chance that it's real and that China or Russia figure it out, well, we've got a big enter profanity of choice problem if they do before we do, and so that will drive it forwards, and it's not going away. And I also think, look, the fact that the military, that so much money is still put into these conventional programs, whatever you want to say about military industrial complex or whatever, is a reflection of the fact that really the people at the top even don't know how this stuff, they are a way away from being able to replicate it. I disagree with some of the people who say, this is just, stuff we could do kind of now. I think the fact, if that was true, the opportunity from a national security point of view of doing that would be so great that we would see at least 100 times more being put into investing to replicate this. But, I think those behind it think that, or those, in charge of allocation of resources are thinking that this is probably something, that's 25, 50 years away at a minimum.
Right. And I guess there might be an argument to say that because of the extreme compartmentalization of defense and the U.S. government, that it's theoretically possible that there is this is purely a need to know basis. And because, we're not in any sort of major world war where it's similar to a World War II scenario, that we wouldn't need to access this equipment. And so it's just buried deep in government compartmentalization. I don't really buy that, but, there is that argument to be made, I guess. What's your response to that?
Well, look, I think if we think, the Cold War, for example, there was a real concern at certainly junctures of the Cold War of an annihilation-based threat level, right? Existential. And so, people who, there would have been an interest, I think, in terms of using, at least at the margins, some of this capability. To try and, we think of maybe Star Wars, right? The great Reagan program, which really was, I think, designed to burn the Soviets out of their existing capital. But why not imply it into, cloaking sensor platforms, right? Satellites that are actually physically and by detection invisible. So that we would have seen more of that. And I also think really, you hit upon this earlier, the nature of government bureaucracy is that ultimately it is very, very hard. It would be extraordinarily hard to the point, I think, of being, that 0.1% below impossible to conceal something like this over such a period of time.
Right.
And so, and that's actually, frankly, why I think it's important to judge skeptically some people who come forward and say they've, been intimately involved with, extraordinary things. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Right. Since that's Carl Sagan, I believe, right?
Right.
So let's pivot a little bit, because you brought up Reagan and you brought up the Star Wars program, and you brought up the idea that this was really, the Star Wars program was really an idea to like trick the Russians into spending a bunch of money on things that they couldn't keep up with anyway. But obviously that program was a bit of a bust. But now here we are pivoting in 2020, and Donald Trump brings forth or develops this idea of Spaceforce. It's so interesting because, here in the US, we're so politically polarized. And so, I imagine if Space Force was created by a Obama administration or a Reagan administration, the left will be all, or a Biden administration, the left will be all about it. But then, and vice versa, I think the same thing could be said about the right, because we tend to not think in terms of policy so often, but in terms of who's saying what and the source, and that polarization has a huge impact on that. Tell me, what are your thoughts? You've been covering Space Force. Like, what are your thoughts on Space Force in general? And then we'll dig a little deeper into the different aspects of it.
I was ambivalent to the idea of creating a separate military branch, whether it might have been better to put it under the Air Force, which really is the kind of, it's sort of like a third arm of the Air Force now.
Right.
But it is there. Certainly, though, there's no doubt in my mind that the idea of establishing career tracks, specific investment programs, far more advanced capabilities, a total sort of all of government focus, or certainly all of military focus on space and cyberspace, a lot of which falls under Space Force.
Is that? I didn't realize that. I didn't realize Space Force had a role in cybersecurity.
It does, yeah. More in the offensive side, and there is, there's the military likes to kind of replicate and have different programs at different areas, but they do have a significant cyberspace responsibility, and it's certainly important. I mean, again, it comes down to what adversary nations, the Chinese and Russians in particular, are doing in terms of building out their own space-based weapons. To the Russians have a very impressive sort of killing satellite that anyway, to bring something out and eats another. I mean, just sort of stuff that makes you think it's sort of like out of Star Wars, but stuff that would destroy or seriously damage the economy, potentially blind the military and the line of command. Right. So we need to be taking it seriously. And I think, to their credit, the Biden administration, has said, Space Force is here to stay. That's to me, it would not be sensible to get rid of it.
Right. But at this point, so let's dig in a little deeper into Space Force. So do you have a good understanding of like what are the different compartments? So I understand that one of the things is protecting satellites, right? So we're not blind militarily. What else is Space Force? And you also mentioned cybersecurity. What else do you see Space Force doing now? And then from where you see them headed, what do you think that looks like over the next 20, 25 years or so?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, you have the defensive side. You also have the sensing side, the ability to build kind of redundant networks of satellites, other sensors that can detect the enemy, guidance systems that are guarded, that can, allow the military to operate, missiles to go onto target. Missile defense obviously comes into that. But I also think part of the understanding behind Space Force is the laying the foundation for capabilities that we don't necessarily know how we're going to use yet. That you have this kind of the idea of space as this sort of great new domain. Well, let's make sure that we have people vested in what we do know, so that when stuff that we don't know arises, whether it's a new capability, we have means of taking advantage of it or defending against it. And so, you know, on one side there is the idea of being complementary to the other military branches. On the other side, I think there is this belief in being able to take advantage of new technologies as they are developed, and applying them into, you know, national defense imperatives.
Right. And I think the marketing strategy of Spaceforce, when you look at recruitment and things like that, and you watch the Spaceforce recruitment videos and things, there is a definite sense of the focus being on the future development and militarization of space. I think a lot of folks, you know, we immediately jump to this idea that we're Space Force immediately will be building, you know, aircraft that are built for you know, flying in space and doing this kind of Star Wars type thing. But obviously that is so far away. You know, I find it fascinating. What do you say to people who say, like, we should absolutely not be militarizing space? We should be working with these other countries. You know, we have the International Space System and the space station, and we're working with other countries when it comes to the development of space technologies. You know, a lot of people believe space should be, we should be working together diplomatically to ensure that space is not militarized. Is that a reasonable expectation, or is that just, it's just not what humans do, or are there? We're not as peaceful enough yet to get there.
Well, I do think it's very important that we maintain, you know, the civilian side of things in terms of NASA and cooperation with other nations, including some adversaries where there is a margin of crossover, you know, in the way you note. But you know, in terms of the militarization of space, I guess it comes down to that basic point that, okay, then do you trust Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and their prospective successors to care about the American national interest, or to try and you know, advance their own interests? And we know from stuff that happens around the world that their own interests are, in some cases, very obviously and significantly opposed to our own. And so to allow them freedom of action in space, I think, would be utterly foolish in terms of the way in which those leaders perceive their own interests and perceive the United States in that context. You know, you can't, you know, if someone is sort of, you know, has a malevolent interest towards you, it does not, I would say, make sense to give them freedom of space to apply that interest should they desire, rather than to try and deter it.
Right.
You know, the world is not an ideal place, unfortunately.
Right.
But you know, again, on those civilian side of things, let's try and, you know, work on that as much as we can.
Right. So you're saying we should be working diplomatically, but at the same time we need to invest in our defense when it comes to space. Let's talk about the U.S. has talked about a.
I mean, I would just add there that you know, there are legitimate debates about what our defensive or offensive policy in space looks like. I right. For example, am skeptical of the idea of throwing huge amounts of money at, you know, missile defense networks that go beyond, you know, North Korea or Iran, threats to China, Russia, because, you know, the likelihood that we're going to be able to, you know, that potentially creates its own sort of arms race dynamic without significant return on investment.
Right, which is potentially very, very dangerous. Let me ask you this: the U.S. has talked about, and I'm trying to make sure I have this right, and you can correct me, please. But we're looking at potentially a moon base on a moon base. Is that something that is specifically military defense, or is that a cooperative effort?
Well, I think yet to be decided. I mean, one of the important things is going to be how does the Biden administration approach space, and I know that, Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, was asked about this and didn't have necessarily a clear answer. But that will be, what does the Biden administration want to do? I think there is some interest, certainly in the scientific domain, to have shared cooperation between different nations in terms of the moon and potentially one day Mars. But again, I think we just don't know. It's the answer, unfortunately.
Right, but we are getting some signals, right? So the Biden administration has said we are not getting rid of Spaceforce, right. And this is something we will be investing in the future. Are there any other signals coming out of Washington and the Biden administration that you're noticing that could be helpful for us to understand the future of Spaceforce?
I do think one reason that I think we might see continued investment in space, especially trying to kind of continue on the Trump trend, which President Obama really abandoned, of getting Americans back into space, right. Is the idea that that perhaps would be a way to unify Americans, right, in a sort of more optimistic tenor, with relatively low investment. If we talk about the kind of things we spend on defense and Medicare and Social Security, an extra 10 billion for NASA to put people into space is not a lot of money. And so, if President Biden is serious about that idea of trying to sort of heal some of the wounds of partisanship, I would think it would be one relatively easy way to do that, and one way that actually does have a relatively strong constituency in both parties in Congress.
Right. And what signals do you see coming out of China and Russia when it comes to them creating an equivalent to Spaceforce, and what their current technology levels are and their ability to kind of compete with us in that domain?
On the Russian side, it's very much, I think, offensive military. That is how they see space, as much as they still have a civilian space program. And partly that is a reflection of their limited resources. I think China, though, it's both. It is the offensive capabilities in terms of military operations, but also very much a civilian exploration side, but not so much exploration in the way that perhaps we would perceive with NASA and the European Space Agency, in terms of finding new understandings in space, scientific research. For China, it is, I think, much more an effort of prestige, in the same way that the space race of the Cold War was a struggle between two competing ideological systems. Right. China views its ability to achieve, presentable success in space as a very important way to both, boost the credibility of the Communist Party at home, but also to show the rest of the world that China is the great new power. And that, is something I think, we have to be aware of with China, that there's a very much more political tenor to their civilian space program, or overtly political tenor, than there is perhaps to NASA's civilian space program.
Do you think this is sort of a new Cold War? Are we in a Cold War with China when it comes to technology and moving into space and defense?
I mean, I would certainly say so. I think if you look at Xi Jinping's objectives in terms of what I would suggest is trying to replace the US-led post-Second World War liberal international order with a more feudal mercantile order, in which Beijing builds patronage networks. Certainly what China is doing in terms of intellectual property theft, its conduct in the South China Sea, its approach to trading regimes, and for all America's flaws and human rights, China's conduct there, I think, is very. If you look at each area, they do build a picture that you can correlate with Xi Jinping's understanding of power and pursuit of greater power. And so, yes, I would say certainly there is a Cold War dynamic underway between the United States and China.
Right.
And I would frankly say the Chinese challenge in that regard is more significant than the Soviet Union's was, because China is able to leverage massive amounts of capital in a way that the Soviet Union never was. I mean, you look at what China has been able to do with the European Union, and really essentially, I mean, they've just signed a trade deal which is going to face a challenge in the European Parliament being ratified, but really, you know, the fact that Western Europe, the kind of bedrock of the American Cold War bloc against the Soviet Union, is now openly, Chancellor Merkel saying we don't pick a side, but quite openly engaged with China in this economic realm. And they are very much aware, to the detriment of American interests, or what American policymakers, including the Biden White House, would wish for. You know, that is significant, I think.
Yeah, no, I was very surprised to hear that. I mean, you know, America has very much separated itself from the European Union during the Trump administration, and we haven't really nurtured that allyship. And now, as Biden steps back in, he wants to redevelop those allyships. But at the same time, we're seeing Merkel and the European Union kind of backing away and saying, no, we're going to have our own relationship with China. We're staying out of this.
Yeah, and I do think you're correct to a degree that President Trump, in his rhetoric and action, was disdainful of allies to a degree that was unhelpful from American, you know, interest point of view, and unproductive from an American, you know, from the long-term interest of the country. But at the same time, I think part of the challenge here is that Europe's conception of interest now is that perhaps turning a blind eye to some of what China is doing, whether it's in the South China Sea or to the Uyghurs or Hong Kong, is acceptable. Intellectual property theft, for example, it's acceptable in return for Chinese economic investment. And that poses the Biden administration with a big challenge. And I think we're going to find out perhaps the limits of, you know, that Biden saying that he wants to rebuild relationships. You know, I think to a degree, the Europeans have just moved their interest point of view. And I think to try and take advantage or strengthen some of those alliances is going to require sometimes a harsher stance from the Biden administration in terms of imposing costs on Europe for getting too close to China, as we would see it, because otherwise, you know, we're going to see what we've seen now. I mean, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, before the Biden administration took office, sent out a tweet that was very obviously designed to try and pressure the Europeans to hold back from signing this trade deal. And without hesitation, it actually fueled the Europeans to get it done before Biden took office. And so, you know, I think it's too simple to say that, you know, Trump was mean to Europe, Biden will be nice, and everything will be happy again. I think the politics of this are much more complicated.
Right. Do you think the Western democracies are at a fundamental disadvantage when you think about totalitarian dictatorships like China, who are experiencing enormous financial growth? And like, do you think that their long view is a fundamental advantage, even though we here in the West value democracy and liberty and freedom, whereas they don't? Do you think that puts us at a fundamental disadvantage in the long term when it comes to socio-political and ultimately space technologies?
You know, in the short term, it can pose challenges in the sense that, you know, Vladimir Putin or certainly Xi Jinping can make decisions quickly and affect policy actions very quickly that they would see as in the national interest. In the longer term, though, no, I think that the challenge China faces, or the two key challenges China faces, number one is that where you have a system in which loyalty to the party trumps creativity, trumps the ability of individuals to experiment, you know, choose their own paths, you really find a situation in which, you know, essentially capital creation is destroyed. That China, you know, there is a reason that China really has struggled with some of the intellectual property protections that the Trump administration brought in, and it is that they do not have a dynamic private sector in the same way we do. And I think that ability to take advantage of technology and changing trends is a core strength of democracy, for all the lethargy that it sometimes comes with that. And I also think as well the ability to deliver improvements in people's lives, or a sense of stake in government, is something, as much as there is huge division in the United States and many European countries, that ultimately people benefit from democracies. And if you look at China, certainly seeing in Russia in terms of protest movements rising now, but China, huge amounts of very impoverished communities, especially in the more rural areas of central and western China, that have not been beneficiaries of the Chinese economic model, and that as China grows more wealthy, and faces export challenges from countries like Vietnam, are they going to be able to? Is she going to be able to provide the sustained increases in living standards and wages that a lot of Chinese have come to expect? And I think that's a big reason, actually, why China is so determined to assert dominance over the South China Sea and the economics of the South China Sea, because, and more broadly with the One Belt Road, because they do not want to be undercut by other nations.
Yeah, I think you said two really important things here. Number one, a democracy and a capitalistic democracy leads to a deeper talent pool of innovation, or at least it incentivizes innovation in a very important way. And two, the totalitarian dictatorship, the authoritarianism, will have a long-term negative impact, in that the people may begin rising up and they'll have to turn their energy and attention back inward. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, and I think also on that, I think innovation, that point is really key, is that where you see what's happened recently with Jack Ma, really one of China's most, in a way, China's Elon Musk in terms of innovative economic enterprise, has been put back in his box because he upset Xi, and that deters investment, deters creativity. And humans are fallible, right? That if you have a group of 8 people, or one, and depending on the standing committee, or Xi Jinping in Beijing, essentially making all the investment decisions, all the regulatory decisions, they're going to make a lot of mistakes that, that a private system, or a capitalist system, I would suggest, can take greater advantage of. And social democracies as well, in the sense that there is a synergy between innovation and government investment that is reflected by politicians wanting to be re-elected, right? They want people to think, oh, that was a good policy, let's vote for them again, instead of Xi thinking it's my way or the highway, because there's no other way.
Well, that actually makes me feel a lot better.
Well, maybe I'll turn out to be totally delusional, right?
I hope you're right. But you make, the points you make are solid, and we have a track record of proving this over and over. I guess my fear is always the espionage and the intellectual property and their ability to steal it so easily. Makes me concerned about the long term, because they have so many investments in southern China, right? Like, they've really, if you could elaborate on this a little bit, because I think a lot of folks in the West don't really understand what China is doing from a banking perspective, and how they're dominating these poorer countries like Cambodia and other countries, to the point where they're almost, some of these countries are almost like indentured servants. What do you see? Where do you see that going?
That's the Belt Road Initiative, that really is designed to, again, political patronage, that there are investments made and fealty is required in return. But again, I think the challenge you see in Africa, Vietnam, the popular opinion in Vietnam against China is off the charts. The popular opinion in favor of the United States is off the charts. You wouldn't necessarily think with Vietnam, but really it is because of a sense that China takes advantage of people for its own interests, Africa, the same populist sentiments about essentially China putting in investments, bribing politicians, using Chinese workers, and fostering unemployment. These political tensions are ones that I think the Chinese were asleep to and are trying to play catch up. And their diplomatic, their foreign ministry, the way in which it deals with critics is still incredibly hostile and I think self-destructive to China's own interests. But it's a function of the fact that they're not used to kind of dealing with this new, more nuanced environment. They took for granted the idea that massive investment would win essentially silent acquiescence, and they're finding that that is just not the case so much because people want to sense that they've got a fair deal. But to your point on the intellectual property, I would say that was one of the Trump administration's legacy successes, whatever you think of the ideology in other areas, is the ability to deny China access either through theft or degrade China's access, certainly not deny, either through theft or purchasing of companies, or for example, one challenge for the Biden administration now will be to continue that, I think, but also to deal with allies like Israel, which really retain, a lot of Israeli companies have pretty significant Chinese shareholders, and China is doing that to try and extract Israeli innovation in a way that is problematic from an American point of view. And so this is going to be the great long-term struggle. It's really the Cold War of control over technology, supply chains, and innovation, is at the forefront there. And I do think, though, that the Biden administration has, at least on that intellectual property point, an understanding because of how destructive and how effective the Chinese Ministry of State Security and the People's Liberation Army, division of the People's Liberation Army, have been in terms of stealing really hundreds of billions of IP a year to the detriment of the economy and really our security interests. So it's a complicated matter, but again, it comes back. What Europe is doing shows that China has cards in its favor.
Right. Can you point specifically to which of the Trump policies have really have had a positive impact on protecting U.S. intellectual property, and then what signals you're getting from the Biden administration to continue that effort?
Well, I think telecommunications would be the biggest example in terms of 5G. The development of the protection of cutting edge hardware chips in terms of being able to prevent those being seized by China. Certainly Taiwan is a good example there, where the US really has an interest in protecting a hardware foundation so that it doesn't fall into Beijing's control. But in terms of telecommunications, look, we had Huawei, the Chinese 5G provider, telecommunications provider, which presents itself as just another company, but really is specifically designed and funded by the Chinese intelligence community to provide deniable backdoors into telecommunications networks the world over. And until the Trump administration came along, that looked like it was going to succeed. I mean, even the UK was doing that. And that really, I don't want to overplay giving the Trump administration credit for it because it may appear partisan, but certainly I think that's something the Biden administration, Mark Warner, has, Senate Democrat, senior Democrat on the Intelligence Committee in the Senate, that they take seriously is protecting those supply chains, because, what China, the British essentially signal intelligence, British equivalent of the NSA a couple of years ago, produced an open report that documented really how Huawei has designed its 5G network with flaws, so that if the British government or the US government went to Huawei and said, we found this flaw, they say, oh, well, sorry about that, let us fix that. But when there are so many of these backdoors, it's a sort of plausible deniability, but really the intent is to be able to generate access points for Chinese spies to be able to collect, whether it's IP or military secrets, conversations, metadata, which is going to be a huge thing. This is a technology is going to be pivotal to deciding who comes out on top.
You wrote an interesting piece for the Washington Examiner recently about Huawei, and you wrote, Huawei is not a 5G telecommunications firm in the vein of Ericsson and Nokia. Instead, it is a deniable corporate agent of the People's Liberation Army's intelligence department. Huawei simply has a private sector interest alongside its PLA responsibilities. I just loved the way you were able to so succinctly put it, because there's so many back doors that could easily have been a huge problem. So with our, the fact that we can't move to a Huawei or something like that, because America is very dependent on infrastructure and technology when it comes to development and cheap labor in China. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to utilize Huawei to produce 5G technology here in the US. How do we do it alone? How do we do it ourselves?
Well, there are other, so Ericsson, Siemens, Nokia. There are other companies that are in the democratic orbit that are doing this. It's going to require some government subsidies, I think, actually, to try and play catch up here, because Huawei very successfully was able to carve out a place by being cheap and affordable and at least deliverable in terms of being able to support 5G networks in a way that a lot of other competitors weren't able to be. I think there's going to have to be a real focus on trying to empower some of that innovation, and I just hope that that we can find a balance between the idea of what Republicans would want, sort of tax credits, lower corporate taxes. Democrats perhaps want more grants but more regulation. We're going to have to find a median point there to be able to try and maximize that, because look, we do need 5G to be able to continue to grow the economy and improve people's lives. So we're going to have to fix that. I suppose, though, I am more optimistic about that, because I do think certainly the intelligence reporting in terms of what China has done with Huawei, what its strategic interests are, and measures of how it behaves in terms of these activities are really clear now, that policymakers can look at it and say, oh wow, they really are doing this. We better get our acts together. It's not like it's complicated, right? It's a complicated subject in the technical side of things, but in terms of the lines of control and investment and usage to the Chinese state in a way that's quite obviously not in America's interests, that is something that all policymakers can look at and say, well, we better do something here.
Right. Let's pivot a moment, and I want to talk a little bit about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. I want to talk about Kuiper. I want to talk about Starlink. Do you think these things? So you've got Huawei coming from China, and the idea was that we would let them in, we'd let them do 5G, and then it could potentially have huge defense problems. Do you think Starlink and Kuiper and these sorts of things could have the opposite effect on China, the ability to give internet to some of these cities, villages, towns that don't have it, including in China, and that could actually have we would then have an ability to influence the cultural context of those and actually create an advantage for ourselves versus China?
Well, not necessarily in the same way that Huawei was intended to do, and organizations like that, because the Chinese can simply, yes, economic growth is a top priority, but control the Communist Party's assurance of power is the absolute number one unequivocal top line for Xi, and particularly him, he's a paranoid leader. Control is pivotal. So he would simply say, even if there's a great economic potential of that and it would make people's lives better, if the Americans are going to try and use this to influence people in terms of getting them more access to information, breaking through internet censorship, etc., we will stop it. The challenge, I think, is that with the evolution of VPNs, the expansion of affordable travel, the ability to constrain understanding of what is going on, is something that China is not going to be able to do as successfully as it would wish over time. And some of the reporting that we see coming out quite relentlessly, and we'll see more from Xinjiang, where the Uyghur minorities are essentially being persecuted by China. China was, I think, quite confident that they could control outflows of information there, so that it wasn't clear what was going on. That has manifestly failed, and much to China's detriment in terms of prestige. The same with Hong Kong, which is why I think you saw the national security law there. But again, the tensions that has created continuing reporting on what is going on there, with certainly major Western multinationals, banking institutions now coming under significant public relations pressure to address whether they are being partners to tyranny. Those things, information poses challenges to China that it cannot constrain, or it cannot constrain to the degree that it would wish. And certainly that is in our favor. I would, for all our flaws, I think when people see, one of the things we saw with the Soviet Union, certainly a dimension that people living abroad would be shocked to see, the juxtaposition of, entertainment that was unrestrained, and also, journalists or opposition politicians being scathing in their attacks on those in power. President Trump, of course, I think would have wished to perhaps constrain that, was unable to do, fortunately, because of the Constitution. But that is our advantage, I think, ideas, because when people realize, either in China, the people in Shanghai have it a lot better than me, or Beijing, and I have no healthcare out in the middle of nowhere. I'm working, to death. My kids have no future. That's a problem. It's also a problem when people in Shanghai and Beijing realize that, maybe, this leadership is more corrupt. I think that Alexei Navalny dynamic that is having such a revolutionary impact now in Russia will be something that happens increasingly in China.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we had such a summer of social unrest here in the United States, and one of my biggest fears internationally and in this socio-political game was that the Russians and the Chinese were sitting here going, haha, we can finally prove to the world that democracy doesn't work. Yet here we are still fighting our way through these things. And now you're seeing the same sort of thing happen in Russia. You're seeing these massive protests. And, I think information is so critical. And now that we have, these things like Starlink starting to take roots, it's one thing if you can, if technology starts to seep into these smaller towns and villages in China, but it's another if they have access to the internet with a VPN and an uplink with Starlink, right?
Right. And again, yeah, the ability, I do, again, the Chinese will prevent some of the infrastructure as much as they can there. Quite frankly, actually, you make a very good point raising that. Xi Jinping would see, I think, American efforts to get around that censorship, if conducted at a significant level, as potentially an act of war, because of how much the Chinese security sense is vested with supreme and unquestioned power in again the Standing Committee and Xi himself. And so, could Jeff Bezos get us into a war? Things we need to think about. I would say the way you deal with that is to have a deterrent posture, that if the Chinese, to take that understanding, the costs imposed on them of taking action would be far greater than they could impose on us. But it's a brave new world. I just think, again, access to information in whatever form is going to be the dominant paradigm. I don't buy into the idea that, because Twitter adopts a certain policy to take people offline and, Parler, is banned from servers or whatever, this is a big thing in the conservative world that people are concerned about. That ultimately, if there is a profit incentive, which again was the driver of Twitter, you're going to be able to find space to communicate. And at the worst level, right, you look at the dark web and some of the things that go on there, it's functional because, there's people see a profit incentive in it. There's a mechanism. You cannot constrain, I think, technology. Ultimately, you cannot constrain it in a way that limits opportunity for people.
Right. So your point is that even when you see these deplatformings happen, you're also going to see new things pop up constantly that are, because there's an incentive model. I think the Parler CEO just got fired from his board. I imagine they're probably trying to reassess and figure out, okay, how can we get some sort of moderation on here so that, we can get our access to our servers back and that sort of thing. It is very fascinating, though, because you do have, this technological left wing, right? You've got the San Francisco Bay Area. You've got these very socially active progressives in big tech. But at the same time, those guys are still influenced by money. So, I just find it interesting because a lot of times on the right, there isn't this technological savvy that the left seems to have. Is that a real fight, or is that something that I'm just kind of working through in my brain here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. And I do think it is problematic that we've seen deplatforming. I think it's bad, but I just think over time, there are the people who've been deplatformed, it's not as if they're going to disappear off into the ether. They are going to find there is going to be an incentive structure for someone to be able to bring them a means of, re-engagement. That dynamism is just the way of things. We see that in kind of conventional media, how CNN had sort of decided, well, with Trump and people perhaps on the center and center left who were concerned and infuriated by Trump, well, let's try and replicate, what Fox News has done. I would say even going further than Fox, quite frankly, in terms of really the cross section of CNN shows being very much more opinion vested. And of course, Fox, the late night or the prime time shows really focused on trying to present an idea of, a voice for the worst fears about what a Biden presidency might mean. And as much as a lot of that on both sides, I think is problematic, it's also a reflection of, consumer choice in a moment that companies are responding to that. And I think the same kind of principle will ultimately apply online. I think that we're in the kind of in a new moment where we're figuring out some of that stuff. But just because we haven't figured it out or hasn't come yet doesn't mean it's not going to come a week, a month, a year from now.
Right, and you bring up such a good point, because the model that the news organizations are built on is a financial model. And at the end of the day, that can have some very short-term negative repercussions when it comes to polarization, but it can also lead to innovation. Things can change. You're an opinion writer, right? I mean, that's your job. Where do you think, where's the balance between, how do you make sure that journalism is as unbiased as possible while still having that commentative those opinion-based forums for folks who want to read things that, they're looking for perspective, right?
Right. I think there's a sort of opportunity I have in foreign policy, national security spaces, that as much as I'm an opinion writer on paper, I've tried to sort of move more towards kind of analysis with,
right,
here's what I think is going on, here's what we should do. So at least if people disagree with that element, they can think, oh, here's original kind of information about what
I see. So you focus on analysis first, and then you kind of build on, okay, here's
or at
what
least I try to, yeah.
Sorry?
No, that's at least what I try to do. And part of that is, I'm not that good a writer, unfortunately, which is not great for a writer. So, analysis kind of helps, because, like I say, A, B, C, instead of, the beautiful prose that you see from the writers, let's say, the New York Times, Journal, the Post, the top, Atlantic, that you really feel you're in a room with them when you read that. Unfortunately, I do not have that skill. So I have to go the analytical way. But I think there's an opportunity. I do like the fact that, my sort of social media following or readership does tend to be a lot of people who are really disagree with me one day, agree the other day, but at least think, oh, here's something to think about.
Right. You said at least think.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully, and because there is. I do think there is. That has been beneficial to me. I mean, I think there are. It's important to have nuance and humility as a writer, and ultimately, unless you're a very big name who has a brand that is very much ideologically identified, it's probably in your interest to do that, because you're able to reach more people, and have them kind of get back to you. I mean, one of the things with foreign policy, national security, is that the more you write in that regard, people who perhaps disagree with you coming from government might reach out to you and say, hey, I've got something to tell you here, because I think you're serious. Whatever.
Right.
It's in certainly with me, it is in my interest to try and remain analytically grounded, because I just wouldn't be, people have this idea that sometimes the top journalists are, finding sources out in the kind of, smoky room or whatever, and recruiting them almost like an intelligence officer recruiting an agent. I think it's much more that you build a profile of credibility and then people come to you.
Right.
Although there is some sort of spycraft stuff sometimes in terms of communication, so the FBI doesn't arrest them, but that's anyway. Yeah.
Right. No, I appreciate that, and I find it. For me, it's very frustrating, the state of journalism today, because, you have a CNN that is very commentary based, right? And you have a New York Times that has become very commentary based, and you have a Fox News. Like, the right and the left are incredibly commentary based, and it just, like, I love Shep Smith, right? Like, he was a daytime guy on Fox News. He really tried to just bring the news straight at you. Now, obviously, he has bias too. Every human being has bias, but I think the news organization should be transparent when it comes to what are facts and what is biased, and you should have your analysis. That's incredibly important. Like, just having facts, like, a lot of people don't know what to do with all those facts. That's fine. So give them analysis, give them opinion, but just be straight with people about what it is.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to sort of be able to take what you would see as sort of positives. One of the things, there's a guy I know a little bit at CNN, Jim Sciutto, who's the chief national security correspondent and anchor. He does provide I think more of the fit in terms of the kind of CNN's have moved more in that opinion model. But in terms of what he has written about and his journalism in terms of the intelligence world, cyberspace, space in China and Russia, he's done some of the most cutting edge and does some of the most cutting edge journalism there is. Tucker Carlson, right? On one issue, people are going to be deeply, love it or offended by it. On the UAP issue,
everyone loves it.
But that created an impact in the Trump administration.
Right.
He was a voice they cared to listen to, and he pushed that. And I think we will find that without that voice, this subject would not have been advanced. And so, there are we've got to be sort of nuanced in our perceptions as well.
So it's almost like you're saying there is this role in media to not only take from, what the White House is saying and delivering it to the public, but actually reflect it back on the White House to influence them. Is that kind of like, is that another piece of this puzzle of what the role of the media is, in your opinion?
Absolutely. No question. In Washington, that's a big thing, and it is why that politicians will try and cultivate senior journalists. Certainly, it's why TV journalists are going to get a lot of access, because their medium allows them to, if the politician makes a good impression on them, and then they go on their show and praise the politician or advance the politician's priorities, you create a relationship there, which of course you have to be very considerate of as a journalist, because you don't want to become a tool of the politician in return for being able to go to the White House and stuff. But I actually think that was something Tucker Carlson did very well with President Trump. Foreign policy, I think, was very skeptical with some of the president's decisions, probably ones that I was sort of more in favor with. But you know, did on that UAP issue, I think, push the White House to say, you know, this is, you know, I'm concerned about this, so you should be as well. And it'll be the same for the Biden administration.
Right.
They want positive coverage and, you know, be able to exert influence. So they will listen to those journalists who have that ability to deliver that for them.
Right. I think one of the concerns I have with the incentivized model of news right now is that it's a lot cheaper and it makes a lot more money just to have a lot of different people with different opinions argue in like 12 boxes on the screen, like a Zoom conversation, as opposed to investigative journalism, right? Like there's no money being spent to put journalists on the ground and send them into the field. Do you see that coming back ever? Like, how do we get there? That's so important,
well,
I think.
Well, part of the opportunity again is cyberspace, right? That the field is you know, virtual rather than physical now, in the sense, and there's a limit to that. Don't get me wrong, right? If there's a conflict or, you know, human rights abuses on the ground, you've got to go there. BBC, you know, has a lot of money to do that, partly because of, you know, government funding. That is important, but there are also more opportunities for, you know, someone to come to you and send something to an encrypted Dropbox, and, you know, then there's a deleted chain, but can you verify who they are, and it becomes complicated. But one of the things I found really inspiring is the wrong word, but positive about journalism in the kind of digital age, away from, you know, physical publications, is that people will still come and read stuff that's original, that people want, that people desire that. And I've seen that, you know, we can watch our traffic on particular articles we've written. And if you're going to break a story that's important, even if it doesn't necessarily have a huge opinion angle that, you know, is going to, the Washington Examiner crowd is going to love, or the CNN crowd, you know, people will come and read it. And that's good. That fosters a profit incentive for journalism. And it is why, you know, publications that have put up paywalls, in some senses, because of their the quality of their reporting and their reputation, have been able very successfully, you know, they're very sustainable again financially, where,
right,
you know, 10 years ago they were worried we're going to go under because no one's buying our newspaper, and advertisers don't want to, you know, give us a lot of money if no one's going to have eyeballs on it.
Right. So you're saying the incentivized model for the news media has presented some extraordinary challenges. A lot of cuts were made. We got away from this hitting the ground, but over time we've developed new systems for monetization, as well as we live in a new world. We live in a digital world where we can now get a lot more news, do a lot more investigative journalism from home almost.
Right. And you know, yeah, I do think that's true. I mean, again, the Debrief, you guys are, you know, going to take advantage of that. I think it'll be successful because you're hitting that that space in terms of, you know, dynamic reporting and analysis on things that are becoming much more important. But also, you know, I think one challenge area is going to be, and is local news. You know, that has suffered because, to a degree, there isn't in a lot of markets a business model that allows you to kind of hit the salary levels for a newsroom staff. And so that, you know, one of the things I think we're seeing a little bit, but hopefully we'll see more of, is philanthropy supporting that, or at least supporting small teams of quality local news, because that is important to holding people, you know, whether it's your local sheriff or a judge or a politician, you know,
right,
big business owner. It's important to national publications are not going to, unless it's a huge scandal, are not going to pick up on that. So there's a cost benefit. I don't want to sound too rosy about it.
No, that makes total sense. You know, one of the things that I find so, you know, that I really appreciate about I mean, you are a prolific writer. Like you've got an article coming out like every day, and the analysis is really good. So, you know, I appreciate the fact that that's still financially viable. Like, you know, you're able to make a living doing that. I just wonder how much more work it is versus a traditional model.
Well, yeah, and there's a cost. Look, I would prefer to, with, you know, full disclosure, I would prefer to write less, but I think the Examiner, one of the choices that we've made is that to be able to have an employment, to have a newsroom, to again pay some very, very good reporters. Without a paywall, we have to maximize our ability to create content. And so that's a very difficult balancing act. And certainly, I do think sometimes journalists are a little bit prima donna-esque in terms of saying, I just want to write once or twice a week, and it's going to be this beautiful depth thing, because to make the balance sheet work, that can be a really big challenge unless you are that huge top level columnist who is going to get so many eyeballs digitally on a page for just one piece. That works. So those top places, right? The newspapers of record have that opportunity because they have that reputation. But for the vast majority of the media landscape, you've got to be creative and content centric. Again, the balancing act, right, is that if you go too far in terms of clickbaitiness, you will drive people away. So it's a very thin, balancing beam is very, very difficult to perfect.
Yeah. What advice would you give to a young, aspiring investigative journalist, any field? Maybe they're interested in UAPs, maybe they're interested in tech, defense, they're interested in human stories, sociology. What advice would you give to those young writers who want to write but are struggling to break in?
Be willing to have a part-time job in the beginning. Obviously, with COVID, that poses its own challenges because so many people are out of work. There's less opportunity for that. You're not going to make money in the beginning. Really, journalism is really, apart from the very top, not particularly well paid. So you've got to want to do it. I'd say reach out to people who you think are you respect as journalists. And a little trick that's been worked well for me is to figure out the email code of the publication, right? Whether it's initial.surname or first name.surname, and send an email and say, Jack-Tom, because the reporter, whoever that person is, or same applies in business, right? That if they know, if they see the first name there, they think, oh, this is someone I know, they're going to open it, instead of if they say Mr. Rogan.
Right.
They might. Fortunately, I suppose I'm such a low-level person that I have time to read all my emails. But people at CNN and Fox are getting literally thousands of emails a day. To try and get, and then you have a two-line thing. I know I'm bothering you. If you give me any advice, or I'll buy you a coffee. And I think high-profile journalists like that kind of gumption, much more in America, to America's credit, than in Europe. Like Americans kind of like that go-getting attitude, because people have been there and they kind of think, okay, this person had the guts to, roll the dice a little bit. That helps. But then again, put FOIA requests in. Go somewhere and interview people. As long as you can be astute to kind of ethics and your own security and stuff. Just go for it, I suppose, the top line.
Right. And what do you want to see from journalism and independent and investigative journalism over the next 10, 20 years?
I mean, I would like to see, and I'm sure we will see, a lot more on the UAP issue. I think it's a huge opportunity, the fact that so few journalists want to cover it and know little about it. A lot of them still believe, a lot of my friends who are very good, much better reporters than I am, still kind of, hey, how are the aliens doing, Tom? They tease me. And, and you don't take it personally, but I tell them, hey, I guarantee you, because, if you have good sources on it, 5-10 years from now, you're going to be thinking, what, I should have got on that beat. And so, again, the incentive will ultimately get there. But I think that will be an opportunity. I also think, for people who, it's important. I would say one of the things that is not necessarily so worthwhile, if you're 18 or kind of college aged, and you're thinking, or below 18, right? That you're thinking, I want to get into journalism. Don't necessarily think about going to journalism school. Go to, if you're interested in cyber or whatever, go and do a cyber degree, and then you come out very young, comparatively, with an expertise portfolio to be able to start doing journalism. It's a big, that is a big challenge for me, right? On the UAP subject, is that some of the theoretical physics, even physics, it's sort of like, I mean, God, I've got to go and Google gravity again and understand how space-time metrics work. And it's, and people see through the BS when you don't know kind of what you're talking about, which, so as one of my friends told me recently, told me, just stay away from some of the physics. Just say, here's what people are seeing and here's what they think it might be, because you don't get the physics.
Right. They're like, we read through that and we know you don't get the physics. Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Can you tell folks where they can read your articles, where they can find you, social media, that sort of thing?
Yeah, great to be with you as well, Michael. So the best place probably is my homepage, which is tomroganthinks.com. And I just put, that was my first blog when I was starting out, just kept the name. I just put all my articles there, which are mainly from the Examiner. And then on Twitter, I'm at Tom R Tweets, very original. And that's it.
Super. Well, again, Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you joining the debrief today. And I certainly hope to talk to you again soon.
Hope so. It was great fun.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.